It was a cold and silent night in Detroit, Michigan, and the city seemed to suffocate under the weight of darkness. The streets were deserted, except for the trembling footsteps of Sarah, a 22-year-old young woman wrapped in an old and faded coat. In her arms, she held her newborn daughter, but her heart was torn between maternal love and suffocating despair. The baby, bundled in a pink blanket, slept innocently, unaware of what was about to happen. To understand what led Sarah to that fateful night, it's necessary to go back in time, to her childhood, when the girl still dreamed of a better future. But reality was relentless. Sarah grew up on the poor side of Detroit, in a marginalized neighborhood where the buildings were old and worn, and the smiles of the people became increasingly rare. Her home, a small, crumbling apartment, was as cold as the life she lived inside. She was the daughter of absent and neglectful parents. Her mother, a depressed woman addicted to painkillers, spent most of her time locked in her room, unable to give the affection or attention that Sarah so desperately craved. The addiction consumed any trace of love that remained, and young Sarah learned early on that she could not rely on her mother to give her the love she saw in other families. Her father, an alcoholic and violent man, came and went from the house as if he were just a guest. When he was present, his words were filled with hatred and resentment, often directed at Sarah, who grew up without understanding what she had done to deserve such disdain. At school, Sarah was withdrawn and silent. Her classmates avoided her, and she constantly felt isolated. While other children brought packed lunches, wore clean clothes, and told stories of happy vacations, Sarah had only silence and the invisible scars of a hard life. At home, the environment was even more oppressive. The fights between her parents were constant, and the sound of breaking objects and painful screams echoed through the thin walls. Once, when she was 8 years old, Sarah tried to intervene in one of these arguments, only to be pushed aside, with her father yelling that she was a burden and that she shouldn't meddle in adult matters. In that moment, something broke inside Sarah. She began to convince herself that maybe it was true, that she was a burden to the world, that she wasn't worthy of love. As the years passed, her adolescence was marked by an even greater emptiness. Without any emotional support or family structure, Sarah had to learn to survive on her own. Her mother eventually left, disappearing without a trace, and her father, lost in alcohol, barely noticed her presence. Sarah spent her days wandering the city streets, trying to escape the oppression of home. Her dreams of a different life, of being someone, began to fade as she faced a hopeless reality. At 16, Sarah dropped out of school. With no money and no guidance, she started taking odd jobs that barely paid her bills. She often slept on friends' couches or wherever she could find shelter. She knew that if she went back home, she would only find more sadness and disillusionment. Loneliness became her most faithful companion, and the emotional abandonment she had suffered in childhood shaped the woman she was becoming, someone who believed she wasn't worthy of care, love, or support. In her teenage years, Sarah still longed for love and belonging. She watched other young women having normal experiences, relationships, parties, college plans. But for Sarah, the reality was different. At 18, she got involved in her first serious relationship, but the man, much older, soon revealed himself to be as abusive and unstable as her father. The cycle of abandonment and emotional despair continued. She sought in the arms of strangers what she had never had at home, affection and security, but she always ended up alone, emotionally exhausted, and more lost than before. The unexpected pregnancy came as a shock. When Sarah discovered she was expecting a baby, she was already completely alone. The baby's father, a fleeting and irresponsible man, disappeared as soon as he heard the news, leaving her with an even heavier burden of fear and uncertainty. Desperate, Sarah tried to find support from social services, but she was met with bureaucracy and the coldness of the system. People looked at her with disdain, as if they already knew her life was a tragedy destined for failure. Without any support network, Sarah found herself repeating the cycle of abandonment that had marked her childhood. Unable to imagine how she could raise a child on her own and unable to see a way out, despair took over her mind and heart. She believed that her daughter would be better off without her, far from the misery and suffering that had defined her own life. On that cold night, as she carried her daughter in her arms, Sarah believed she was doing the only thing she could, giving her daughter a chance, even if it was through a desperate act. The child, wrapped in a faded pink blanket, slept peacefully, unaware of what was happening around her. Sarah looked at the baby's face with tears in her eyes. Part of her wanted to hold her daughter forever, but the other part, the one that constantly reminded her of her brutal reality, knew she couldn't give this child the life she deserved. After wandering for hours, Sarah stopped in a quiet alley where the smell of garbage and dampness filled the air. She looked around as if waiting for divine intervention, but there was no one there to save her from this decision. Trembling, she knelt beside a garbage bin and, with shaking hands, placed the baby inside. She carefully adjusted the pink blanket around the child and placed a small silver necklace on the baby's chest. A simple necklace, a symbol of a love she hoped would one day be understood. As she walked away, Sarah felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Every step felt like an unbearable burden, as if she were leaving behind not just her daughter, but a vital part of herself. Tears fell silently as she wondered if she would ever be able to overcome this pain. She stopped, took a deep breath, and looked back one last time, hoping that somehow someone would find the child and give her a better life than she could ever offer. As she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the night, Sarah felt the coldness of solitude completely take over her. Guilt and regret accompanied her with every step, but she knew there was no turning back. On the same cold night in Detroit, fate intervened in an unexpected and moving way. Margaret, an elderly homeless woman, was wandering the city in search of shelter for the night. Known for her kindness and her ability to survive on the streets, Margaret was a familiar figure to many in the neighborhood. Despite her own hardships, she maintained an unshakable generosity and a watchful eye for those who, like her, were lost. As she walked through the dark and silent alleys, Margaret heard a faint sound, almost like a sigh. Driven by curiosity and her nurturing instinct, she followed the sound to a trash bin, where she found something that made her stop breathing for a moment. A small baby, wrapped in a pink blanket, with a serene face, sleeping despite the cold around her. Margaret could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her eyes, tired from the harsh reality of the streets, filled with tears as she gently picked up the baby in her arms. "Who could do this?" she whispered to herself as she held the child close to her chest to warm her. Despite her own miserable situation, Margaret knew she couldn't leave the baby there. Instinctively, she decided to protect her. Without hesitation, Margaret sought help. She knew she couldn't care for the child alone, but she also knew exactly where to find people who could help. On the streets of Detroit, she had learned the pathways and places where kindness still existed. With the baby in her arms, Margaret quickly walked to the nearest police station, where, without being questioned about her own condition, she handed the child over to the authorities. The baby was taken to a local hospital, where she received the necessary medical care. Despite the circumstances of her abandonment, the child was healthy, as if some miracle had protected her small life. There were no signs of violence or abuse, and the doctors were relieved to know that with proper care, she had a promising future ahead. Without documents, without a name, and with no one who could be identified as a relative, the baby was turned over to the social services system. She was taken to an orphanage in Detroit, where the caregivers, charmed by her strength and sweetness, named her Emma. The name Emma was chosen in honor of one of the orphanage's founders, a woman known for her dedication to children. From the beginning, Emma stood out among the other children for her curiosity and kindness. She had a sparkle in her eyes, and a willingness to help that made everyone around her feel welcome. Although she didn't know her past or the sacrifice her biological mother had made, Emma grew up surrounded by affection and care at the orphanage. However, even surrounded by love, Emma always felt the absence of her own story. While other children eventually found new homes through adoption, she remained at the orphanage. The caregivers tried to ease her loneliness, but Emma always wondered about her biological parents. Who were they? Why had they left her? This mystery became a part of her, shaping her view of the world and her deep empathy for those who also felt abandoned. The pink blanket that was found with her became an important symbol in her life. Emma never knew who had left her in that trash bin, but she kept the blanket as a treasure, a link to the past she never knew. At night, while the other children slept, she often wrapped herself in the blanket, holding it tightly, imagining who her mother might have been and why she had decided to leave her behind. When Emma came of age and left the orphanage, she carried with her the pink blanket and the deep desire to make a difference in people's lives. Over the years, the mystery of her abandonment had made her develop a special sensitivity towards others, especially those who, like her, had been left on the margins of society. This experience shaped her life's purpose: to help the vulnerable, the abandoned, those who needed emotional and physical support. Emma decided to become a caregiver for the elderly, believing that her empathy and her own experience of abandonment would give her a unique connection with those who also faced difficult times. She enrolled in nursing courses and, over time, specialized in geriatric care. Working in nursing homes and care facilities filled her with a sense of purpose, allowing her to offer care and comfort to those in a vulnerable stage of life. Her determination and compassion soon made her stand out as an exceptional caregiver. Emma had a natural gift for listening, for calming others, and for deeply understanding the needs of her patients. Although she was grateful for having found a vocation that fulfilled her, the emptiness surrounding her own family history continued to linger in her heart. She still kept the pink blanket and the simple necklace that had been found with her, and in some quiet moments, she wondered if she would ever have answers about her past. At 30, Emma received a job offer in Cleveland, Ohio, to work at a new nursing home. The facility had a good reputation, known for its caring approach to the elderly. Emma accepted the opportunity with enthusiasm, believing that this new chapter in her life could bring new experiences and perhaps a renewed sense of purpose. When she moved to Cleveland, Emma took with her the few belongings that really mattered: the pink blanket and the necklace. She never left these objects behind, as they were the only tangible connection she had to her unknown past. Despite the challenges, Emma had learned to live with the mystery of her origins, but she never stopped feeling a pang of pain when thinking about the woman who had abandoned her. At the nursing home, Emma quickly stood out as one of the best caregivers. Her patience and empathy won over both the patients and her colleagues. However, she had no idea that there, in the midst of her new job, fate was about to bring her a reunion that would forever change her life. 30 years had passed since the night Sarah abandoned her newborn daughter in a trash bin on the cold streets of Detroit, and her life had changed in unexpected ways. Now 52, Sarah lived in Cleveland, Ohio, not by choice. She was a resident of the Cleveland Care Home, where she received daily care due to her debilitating condition. Sarah wasn't there because of old age, but because of a chronic illness that had consumed her health and mobility over the years: multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis was relentless. The disease began to manifest when Sarah was in her 40s, with subtle symptoms like numbness in her hands and difficulty balancing. At first, she ignored the signs, attributing them to the stress of daily life. Sarah had spent most of her life trying to move on, despite the regret she carried for what she had done to her daughter. However, as the years passed, the symptoms worsened. The physical weakness became more intense, falls were frequent, and soon she could no longer perform simple tasks on her own. Over time, multiple sclerosis robbed her of her ability to walk and even speak clearly. The official diagnosis was a heavy blow, confirming what Sarah had feared: the disease was progressive and incurable. Her independence gradually disappeared, forcing her to withdraw from the active life she still tried to maintain. Increasingly isolated and dependent, Sarah had no family to help her. She lived alone, without children or close relatives. Friends had drifted away over the years, and her declining health left her completely reliant on professional care. The decision to be admitted to a care home wasn't easy, but there was no other option. With the limitations imposed by multiple sclerosis, Sarah lost the ability to care for herself. She needed help with eating, bathing, and even speaking on days when weakness overtook her body and mind. The Cleveland Care Home became her new home, but for Sarah, it was a constant reminder of her irreversible condition and the loneliness that consumed her. While her physical health deteriorated, her emotional health had been in ruins for decades. Sarah wasn't only battling multiple sclerosis, but also the ghosts of her past. All these years, she had never overcome the pain and guilt of abandoning her daughter. The image of that night in Detroit, when she left her baby in the trash bin, still haunted her dreams. With every progression of the disease, Sarah felt as if she were being punished for her choices. She constantly wondered what had happened to her daughter. Did someone find her? Did she survive? Did she have a good life? Or had Sarah condemned the child to a life of suffering? These questions never gave her peace, and as the years passed, the regret and pain grew, corroding any chance Sarah had of finding peace within herself. Although she had tried to bury those emotions, the illness only intensified her emotional isolation, making her feelings of guilt and loss even deeper. At the care home, Sarah had no one to share these feelings with. The other patients were fighting their own battles, and the nurses and caregivers were busy tending to everyone's physical and medical needs. Visits were rare and came only from healthcare professionals and social workers. No friends or family came to see her. Sarah was just another case at the care home, another patient in a quiet room, living her days between physical weakness and the emotional weight she carried. When Sarah was transferred to the Cleveland Care Home, she didn't know that fate was about to intertwine her life with that of the daughter she had abandoned 30 years earlier. Amid the routine of medical appointments, physical therapy, and days when she could barely get out of bed, Sarah met Emma, a young caregiver who had recently started working at the home. Emma was one of the most attentive caregivers, always there to offer maximum comfort to the patients. Sarah, weakened by the disease, appreciated the young woman's kindness, though at first they didn't speak much. Emma was used to dealing with patients in advanced stages of multiple sclerosis. She knew that the disease affected not only the body, but also the mind and spirit. That's why she always tried to bring a bit of light to her patients, even those in severe states like Sarah. Over time, Emma's dedication began to stand out to Sarah, though the elderly woman never had the strength to express how much it touched her. Despite the physical closeness between Sarah and Emma, neither of them knew they were connected by something much deeper. To Sarah, Emma was a kind caregiver, a comforting presence in moments of pain and fragility. To Emma, Sarah was just another patient she tried to give dignity and care. However, fate was about to reveal the bond that united them, a bond that had been severed in the past but had never completely disappeared. The days at the care home passed slowly and repetitively. Sarah, often confined to her bed or wheelchair, had plenty of time to reflect on her past. And every time she looked at Emma, she felt a strange connection. There was something about the young woman that seemed familiar, something she couldn't identify, but that sparked curiosity in her. Emma, on the other hand, helped Sarah with her daily needs: feeding, hygiene, and sometimes just silent companionship, which Sarah never asked for but seemed to appreciate. One afternoon, as Emma adjusted Sarah's position in her wheelchair, the elderly woman, in a weak and hesitant voice, asked, "Do you like your job?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Emma, surprised by the question, gently replied, "I do. I like taking care of people. I think everyone needs someone, you know?" Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't have the strength to respond, but something in that answer touched her deeply. Everyone needs someone. Sarah, who had lived much of her life without anyone, wondered if she had ever been that someone for her daughter. Those words echoed in her mind as Emma continued tidying the room. The days dragged on in the care home, and Sarah's health slowly worsened. She was now completely dependent on the caregivers, and Emma, always attentive, spent more time with her. One afternoon, while Emma was adjusting Sarah's blankets, the elderly woman looked at the young woman with a curious expression. For some reason, Emma's face seemed to stir a strange sense of familiarity in Sarah, something she couldn't explain. She wanted to ask a question, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. After a long silence, Sarah finally gathered the courage to ask, "Do you have family?" Her voice came out trembling and hesitant. Emma, surprised by the direct question, paused for a moment before answering. "Not that I know of. I was left in an orphanage when I was a baby. I don't know anything about my parents." The answer hit Sarah like a punch. Her heart began to race, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Emma's voice echoed in Sarah's mind as she processed what she had just heard. She didn't know what to do with this information, but something deep and instinctual made her realize that this young woman in front of her could be much more than just a caregiver. A few days later, while Emma was making Sarah's bed, she pulled out a small, faded pink blanket from her bag, folded carefully. It was a cold night, and Emma often carried the blanket with her to cover herself during work breaks. She always kept it close, as it was the only reminder she had of her unknown past. When Sarah saw the blanket, she froze. Her gaze locked onto the piece of fabric, and suddenly the memories of that night in Detroit came flooding back with overwhelming force. She recognized that blanket. It was the same blanket she had wrapped her newborn daughter in before leaving her in the trash bin. Her body paralyzed, and tears began to well up in her eyes as she struggled to speak. "That blanket," Sarah whispered with difficulty, her voice hoarse with emotion. Emma looked at the blanket, not understanding Sarah's reaction. "Yes, it's the only thing I have from my childhood," she responded, unaware of what it meant to the elderly woman. Sarah, now with her heart racing, knew, without a doubt, that Emma was her daughter. The pieces of the puzzle were painfully and inescapably falling into place. She wanted to scream, to confess everything, but she was paralyzed by fear. What would Emma do if she discovered the truth? Could she ever forgive her? The guilt and regret of 3 decades now weighed more heavily than ever, and Sarah found herself facing an undeniable truth, one she could no longer ignore. The revelation hit Sarah like a crushing blow. The sight of the pink blanket in Emma's hands not only brought back memories of the night she abandoned her daughter, but also the certainty that the young caregiver who had been tending to her with such dedication was the daughter she had left behind 30 years ago. Sarah's emotions were raw. Shock, regret, pain, and a glimmer of hope began to mix inside her. She knew, without a doubt, that the blanket was the same one she had used to wrap her newborn daughter on that fateful night in Detroit. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Everything fit. Emma's age, the fact that she had been abandoned in an orphanage, and now, the blanket. The regret that had accompanied Sarah for so many years grew more intense, suffocating her. She needed to tell Emma the truth, but how? How could she explain that the woman debilitated by multiple sclerosis in front of her was the mother who had abandoned her in a trash bin? After days of internal turmoil, Sarah decided she could no longer bear the weight of silence. She knew Emma deserved to know the truth. On a quiet afternoon, as Emma was in the room, folding clothes and organizing Sarah's belongings, the elderly woman finally broke the silence between them. "Emma?" Sarah called out, her voice weaker than usual, as if it was being carried by the pain consuming her. Emma stopped what she was doing and approached, sensing that something was different. "Yes, Sarah? Do you need something?" she asked in her usual gentle tone. Sarah took a deep breath, her trembling hands resting in her lap. She knew she was about to change the course of both their lives. I need to tell you something. Something I've kept for a long time. Something that I don't know if you'll be able to forgive me for. Emma frowned, confused by the seriousness in Sarah's voice. What happened, Sarah? She asked, feeling the weight in the air. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she began to speak, her voice faltering. The blanket you carry. I know that blanket. It's the same one I used to wrap my daughter, the daughter I abandoned. She paused, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. Emma, I'm your mother. Emma froze as if time had stopped. Sarah's words hit her like thunder. The shock was instantaneous. She felt the air leave her lungs, and a wave of disbelief washed over her. What? What are you saying? Emma asked, her voice hesitant, as if she didn't want to believe what she had just heard. Swallowing hard, Sarah, with tears now streaming freely down her face, continued. 30 years ago, I was a lost young woman, with no resources, no support. I did something terrible. I abandoned you, my daughter, because I thought you would be better off without me. And now, you're here. And I'm here. And I can't hide it from you anymore. Emma felt the ground open up beneath her. The silence in the room was deafening. Her mind spun, trying to process the devastating revelation. The woman she had been caring for, with such compassion, was the same person who had abandoned her in a trash bin. Anger, pain, and confusion began to well up in her chest. The anger finally exploded in Emma, who took a few steps back, unable to hold back her tears. You abandoned me? She said, her voice filled with emotion. I spent my whole life not knowing who my parents were, not knowing why I was left behind, and now you're telling me it was you who abandoned me, as if that's something you can just explain away? Sarah, heartbroken, tried to hold back her sobs but failed. I know nothing I say will fix this, Emma. I made a terrible choice. I was lost, scared, and I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought someone better than me could give you the life I never could. Emma, still in shock, felt a mixture of sadness and anger take over her. Better without you? You left me to die in a trash bin, Sarah. How could that ever have been the best for me? She cried, her pain spilling out in her words. Sarah lowered her head, unable to meet Emma's eyes. I know. I've never forgiven myself for it. Never. The regret has haunted me all these years, Emma. And now, seeing you here, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. The room fell silent again, both women wrapped in a storm of raw emotions. Emma felt an overwhelming pain hearing Sarah's words, but at the same time, part of her couldn't ignore the fact that, despite everything, she now had the answers she had always longed for. The following days were tense and quiet. Emma avoided interacting with Sarah as much as possible, trapped in her own emotional whirlwind. She had spent her whole life trying to understand why she had been abandoned, and now that she finally had the answers, she didn't know how to deal with them. One day, after days of reflection and tears, Emma entered Sarah's room, ready to face the situation head-on. Sarah was lying down, her health more fragile than ever, and she looked like a shadow of the woman she once was. When Emma entered, Sarah turned her head slowly, her tired eyes meeting the young woman's. Emma approached slowly and sat beside Sarah's bed, holding the elderly woman's hand. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. I don't know if I ever will. But I also can't spend the rest of my life angry. I spent years wondering why I was abandoned. Now I know. And as much as it hurts, I know you've carried that weight too. Sarah looked at Emma with tear-filled eyes, unable to speak but deeply grateful for her words. Emma took a deep breath, her emotions still raw. I'm still trying to make sense of all of this, but you You're not alone. Not anymore. As daily routines continued in the care home, the atmosphere between Emma and Sarah was thick with tension. Each interaction was brief and full of uncomfortable silences. Although Emma remained professional, she couldn't help the accusatory look she carried in her eyes. Sarah, on the other hand, debilitated by multiple sclerosis and emotionally crushed by the confession she had finally made, had grown even quieter, bearing the weight of 3 decades of guilt. The day of the inevitable confrontation between mother and daughter finally came. Emma was finishing her shift, and Sarah, seated in her wheelchair, watched her from a distance, feeling the emotional chasm between them. Unable to endure the heavy silence any longer, Sarah took the initiative to speak. "Emma," she began, her voice weak and hesitant. "I can't let things stay like this. I know I hurt you, and I need you to know why." Emma stopped in the middle of the room, her heart racing. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Taking a deep breath, she slowly turned to face Sarah, her hands still trembling. "Why?" she repeated, her voice a mix of pain and anger. "Why? Do you think explaining it will change anything? I spent my entire life wondering why I was abandoned. Do you think anything you say now will make that go away?" Sarah lowered her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "No, Emma. I know it won't. There are no excuses for what I did, and I will never forgive myself for it. But you deserve to know the truth. Even if it doesn't redeem me, even if you never forgive me, I need you to understand what led me to do it." Emma, now struggling to control her emotions, took a step forward but kept her distance. "Then tell me, Sarah. Tell me why. Why did you leave me in a trash bin? Why did you decide I wasn't worth it?" Sarah sobbed, her voice almost inaudible. "I was a lost young woman. I was alone with no support, no money, no hope. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. The father of the baby abandoned me, and my family, they turned their backs on me. I thought I couldn't give you the life you deserved. I thought I was saving you from a life of misery. But, Emma, I was wrong. I know that now. But at the time, all I could think was that you would be better off without me." The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Emma, with teary eyes, looked at Sarah, trying to process the words. Her anger and hurt were still there, but now mixed with something deeper, an overwhelming sadness. "And you never tried to find me? Not even for a second to see what happened to me?" Emma asked, her voice full of disbelief. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of guilt pressing on her chest. "I wanted to. God knows how much I wanted to. But the shame, the fear, I couldn't. I thought you would be better off without me, and I was too terrified to face what I had done. I know I was weak. I was a coward. I know that, Emma." Sarah's words pierced Emma's heart, but they also brought to the surface a rage she could no longer contain. All her life, she had wondered what she had done wrong, why she wasn't worthy of her parents' love, why she had been abandoned. And now, the truth was laid bare in front of her. "You left me. You abandoned me as if I meant nothing," Emma shouted, her voice finally breaking under the pressure of years of repressed pain. "You have no idea what it's like to grow up not knowing who you are, wondering every day why you weren't good enough for your own mother." Sarah felt every word like a blow, tears streaming down her face already marked by illness and time. "I know, Emma, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for that. I made the wrong choice, and now I'm paying for it every day. You have every right to hate me. I understand that, but please believe me when I say that I have always loved you. Even in that terrible moment, I loved you." Emma, breathless, turned away, unable to look at Sarah for another second. The room was thick with palpable pain, as if every breath was an enormous effort. The emotional confusion flooding her was too much to bear. Emma had always prided herself on her ability to care for others, to understand their pain. But now, confronted by her own mother, the woman who abandoned her, she felt powerless. After the confrontation, Emma spent days without speaking directly to Sarah. She needed space, needed to think. The anger still burned inside her, but there was something else, a need to understand, to find peace within herself. During this time, Emma reflected on her mother's story, on how abandonment had shaped her life, and also on how she had survived it. One day, Emma walked into Sarah's room, determined to have a final conversation. Sarah, in her increasingly fragile state, lifted her eyes to her daughter, expecting the worst. But Emma, still wounded, was ready for something more. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah," Emma began, her voice calmer than she expected. "The pain I felt for so many years, that's not going to disappear. But I also know that if I carry this anger forever, it will consume me. I don't want that." Sarah looked at Emma, hope briefly flickering in her eyes. "I never wanted you to suffer, Emma. Never. And I accept whatever you decide. I just want you to find peace, even if that means leaving me behind." Emma sat down beside Sarah, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I still don't know what forgiveness means. I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely forgive you. But maybe the first thing I can do is try to understand what happened and how to move forward." Sarah took Emma's hand, her eyes filling with tears. "That's more than I could ever hope for. Thank you, Emma. Thank you for giving me a chance, even if I don't deserve it." Total reconciliation still seemed distant, but at that moment, mother and daughter began to build a new bridge. The scars of the past wouldn't be erased easily, but both knew that the first step had been taken. And sometimes that first step is the most important. Sarah was more fragile than ever, both physically and emotionally. The multiple sclerosis was advancing rapidly, and time was starting to feel limited. The doctors at the care home didn't give her much longer, adding even more pressure to the situation. The disease had taken over her movements, and even speaking was a struggle. The young woman she once was had disappeared, replaced by a shadow of what remained. But now, Sarah's only wish was to fix what she could before her time ran out. One morning, Emma entered Sarah's room, calmer than she had been in the previous days. The anger, although still present, no longer consumed her as it had before. She realized that, to move forward, she needed to make a decision about what to do with everything that had transpired. She sat beside Sarah, who was lying down, her eyes closed, but she stirred when she sensed her daughter's presence. "Emma," Sarah began with difficulty, her voice weak, almost a whisper. She didn't know what to say or what to expect. Emma looked at her mother, still trying to comprehend everything that had happened between them. "You don't need to say anything today, Sarah," Emma said calmly. "I know it was hard for you to tell the truth, and I know carrying that secret for so long must have been unbearable." Sarah slowly turned her head to look at Emma, her eyes brimming with tears. "I hurt you in a way I can never fix, and that has destroyed me inside, Emma. All these years, I just wanted you to have a better life than I could give you." Emma sighed, trying to organize her thoughts. "I'm still trying to understand how I feel about all this, but I've realized something in these past few days. I can't keep living with this anger inside me. It's only going to destroy me, and maybe forgiveness won't come all at once, but I'm willing to try. At least that." Sarah couldn't hold back her tears, and for the first time since she made her confession, a small glimmer of hope appeared on her face. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." Emma simply nodded. She still didn't know how she would move forward, but she knew she was taking the first step to free both of them from the weight of the past. As the days passed, the relationship between Emma and Sarah began to change. The hostile silence that had lingered between them had lessened, giving way to occasional, quieter, and more sincere conversations. Though discussing the past was still delicate, mother and daughter began to share small moments of reconnection. One afternoon, while helping Sarah bathe, Emma noticed that her mother seemed more at peace, more accepting of the reality of their situation. There was less tension between them, as if both were in some way coming to terms with what couldn't be changed. As Sarah prepared for bed, Emma started speaking, almost as if thinking out loud. You know, I always wondered what you were like, if you ever thought of me or if I was just a vague memory. Sarah, already lying down, took a deep breath before responding, her voice still weak. I thought of you every day, Emma. There were moments when I wondered if I had done the right thing. Sometimes I thought I had. Other times, I thought I had made the worst mistake of my life. But I always knew you were out there, living your life. And deep down, I prayed that you had found happiness. Emma looked at Sarah, trying to process the idea that, even from a distance, her mother had never forgotten her. I think, in some way, I always knew you were out there, Emma said softly, almost to herself. Maybe that's why I kept the blanket all these years. It was the only thing that connected me to you. Sarah closed her eyes, tears silently streaming down her face. Time couldn't be reversed, but there was a sense that, however late, the truth was finally being faced. As the months passed, Sarah's health deteriorated drastically. The progression of multiple sclerosis left her increasingly weak, and her days of lucidity became fewer and fewer. Emma and Sarah both knew their time together was running out. One winter morning, Emma entered Sarah's room and found her in a particularly fragile state. The exhaustion was evident, and Sarah's breathing was slower, more labored. Emma sat by the bed, holding her mother's hand. They didn't need words anymore. Their presence was enough. Sarah opened her eyes, her gaze distant, but upon sensing Emma's presence, a peaceful expression crossed her face. She tried to speak, but she had no strength. All she managed was a faint squeeze of Emma's hand, which was enough to convey all she felt. With tears in her eyes, Emma whispered, "It's okay, Sarah. You don't have to fight anymore. I'm here." Sarah gave a small smile, her eyes locked on Emma's. She felt that, although their time together had been brief, that moment was what mattered most. No regrets, no more secrets, just the comforting presence of her daughter by her side. Shortly after, Sarah closed her eyes for the last time, with Emma holding her hand until the end. She passed away peacefully, knowing that despite everything, her daughter was with her in her final moments. Sarah's funeral was simple, quiet, but marked by a sense of relief and closure. Emma felt a deep sorrow, but also a certain comfort in knowing that, in the final months, she and her mother had managed to start the process of healing. Though complete forgiveness was still a complex and ongoing process, Emma knew that, in the end, she had taken the first step in freeing herself from the burden she had carried for so long. Back at the care home, Emma continued her work as a caregiver, but now with a new understanding of what it meant to forgive and be forgiven. She kept the pink blanket with her, no longer as a symbol of abandonment, but as a reminder that love and redemption, no matter how late, are still possible. The story of Emma and Sarah wasn't perfect, nor did it have a completely happy ending, but there was a profound lesson within it. The true value of life is not in the failures or mistakes of the past, but in the opportunities we have to fix what is possible and to find peace in our own choices. The cycle of pain and regret had been broken, and in the end, mother and daughter found, in their own time and in their own way, a path to reconnect and transform their scars into bridges of healing. If you enjoyed this emotional story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you can stay updated on all the new stories and videos we post. And how about leaving a comment below? We want to hear what you thought about Sarah and Emma's journey. Is forgiveness something easy to grant, even in a story so filled with pain? Did you relate to any moment in this mother-daughter journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. Oh, and don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel. We have many more exciting stories, full of twists, life lessons, and captivating characters. See you in the next video.